Hello and welcome to our presentation. Today we will talk about leadership and corruption in regards to a scandal in the Los Angeles Police Department. Before we get into the details, I'll provide a brief overview of what we are going to talk about in this presentation. First, we're going to summarize and give the background information on what the Rampart scandal was and its implications. Next, we're going to analyze the ineffective leadership styles that allowed for this corruption to become so significant, such as laissez-faire style of leadership and Theory Y by McGregor. Then we will look at what leadership styles would have been better in this scenario. So participative leaderships and transformational leadership styles would have been much better. And then we'll conclude.
Policymakers created the war on crime to cope with the rapid growth of violent crime from the 1960s to 1990s. This led to the creation of the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlum Units, known as the Crush Units, in Rampart during the 1970s. Rampart is an area located at the west of downtown Los Angeles, where crimes frequently occurred. During the existence of Crush, there were thousands of gang members in the 8 square miles of Rampart. In the late 1990s, a significant amount of corruption was uncovered inside the Crush units. At the epicenter of this corruption was an officer named Rafael Perez. The institutionalized corruption in the Crush units was difficult to determine due to the nature of the secrecy of corruption. Regardless of how many officers are involved, the corruption was significant. The Rampart scandal disclosed a complex level of police corruption. This included incidents of police brutality, shootings of unarmed suspects, the planting of fake evidence on suspects, false testimonies, and police conducting criminal activities for personal gain.
The Rampart scandal resulted in many negative outcomes. 106 criminal convictions were overturned as a result of unhonest testimony and dirty evidence given by police. 24 officers were initially found guilty in court. However, some had their convictions overturned at a later date. The corruption costed as much as $1 billion. This came from legal fees, lawsuits, such as payouts to the victims that were initially convicted and put into prison. It also resulted in temporary federal oversight of the LAPD for years. LAPD reform quickly followed this scandal. There are many reasons for why the police leadership failed to prevent this scandal.
There were two types of leadership styles that exist in the Rampart Crush units, and the LAPD leadership allowed for the corruption to develop and become entrenched without being challenged. These leadership styles were the laissez-faire style of leadership and the belief of McGregor Theory Y. The laissez-faire leadership was inadequately implemented by managers and supervisors in the Crush unit. This insufficient leadership allowed for corruption to exist. In Rampart's scandal, the laissez-faire leadership was lack of supervision of subordinates and did not provide regular feedback. The Crush units were not closely monitored by supervisors, and operating guidelines were frequently determined by the subordinates. They based their work off informal substation, which kept them separated from police leadership at official police stations. The Crush unit disconnected from leadership and held secondary roll call meetings on their own. In the secondary meetings, Crush officers would use their own views to conduct law enforcement. However, these views typically did not follow the lawful processes and were corrupt in practice. The disconnection to the ethical leadership of command tolerated corruption in the Crush units. As scandals were taken on trial, the convicted officers stated that they felt they could commit illegal activity and would not be accountable because of the lack of leadership involvement. Retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey believed leadership supervision would have benefited the Crush units. The supervision of public workers would improve conduct of fairness, honesty, professionalism, and ultimately reduce the risk of corruption. Corruption would have reduced if the Crush operation leaders replaced laissez-faire practices with participative style of leadership. Another study finds that severe leadership would cause unfavorable behavior to officers, and resulting in a higher chance of corruption comparing to transformational leadership.
Crash unit leaders in the LAPD command structure operated under the assumption that the crash officers were motivated by McGregor's Theory Y. Theory Y involves trusting subordinates to work properly, and it has an optimistic view of their motivation. Though this is not necessarily an ineffective view, it was overemphasized, and this allowed the corruption to easily exist. Theory Y can be demonstrated in the police department leadership in their views of over-trustfulness of the officers. The leadership also assumed officers would act according to the organizational standards, such as acting lawfully, when this clearly wasn't the case. Theory Y existed in such a significant manner in the LAPD culture that it biased the leaders to have an inaccurate view of the Rampart workers. The LAPD believed in faith over practices, and they were strongly predispositioned to believe their members' actions were typically right. This resulted in a lack of critical evaluations of the Rampart officers' work and contributed to reduced supervision. For example, when an officer was involved in a shooting, there would be a preliminary investigation. These investigations were normally not extensive, and the investigators were usually biased to not view the officer's actions as criminal. If Theory Y was not overemphasized in the LAPD leadership, there would have been an improved chance to detect the corruption earlier. A review of Perez's reports with a more objective mindset would have discovered that many of his reports insufficiently articulated his probable cause for his actions, and we know how corrupt this officer was. Since this did not happen, the perjury, shootings, and brutality against the community done by the police was able to exist with little challenge. It is to the detriment of law and order that the police leaders let their biased trust result in the early conclusions of questionable actions.
We have talked about the problems, but what about solutions? If the LAPD crash unit would operate under participative leadership and transformational leadership, the extent and the likelihood of corruption would have been reduced significantly. The use of participative leadership style by the command would have reduced corruption. Participative leadership involves leader valuing the input from members and peers. However, the leader makes the final decision. If the police command involved the local leaders of crush in reviews of enforcement strategies, the leadership would have been able to better influence, monitor, and instill ethical professionalism into crush members. Employees would learn to accept change and ethically influencing them to have good effect on reducing the risk of corruption, as the crush officer's attitude would adopt to be more honest. In addition, a more recent study of government organizations finds that increased ethical leadership reduces corruption. However, the LAPD allowed crush units to operate almost entirely independent, with substandard guidance.
Transformational leadership is another leadership style that would have reduced corruption in the Rampart area. Transformational leadership focuses on team building and collaboration between the workers and the superiors. It involves different levels of an organization empowering work teams to make ethical decisions. Ultimately, it guides the individual to make the moral choice that reflects on organizational standards. So how does this look in police work? A longitudinal study that controlled for many variables found that transformational leadership reduces corruption. Under transformational leadership, employees improve in professional behavior and are more likely to report misconduct. This is because transformational leadership improves moral courage, moral capacity, and moral efficacy. The absence of transactional leadership among crash police officers attributed to their corruption. Street officers were left unchecked and frequently enforced their own abuse of power. Instead of following the LAPD integrity and law-abiding ethics, some officers disregarded it completely. In regards to selfish and corrupt conduct, Perez stated, "The ends justified the means." So he didn't care about honesty, he just cared about getting his own personal end result. Furthermore, a rigorous statistical study found that when transformational leadership was present among police, it reduces corruption by 38%. Transformational leadership could have acted as a protective factor against this kind of misconduct that occurred in the LAPD. A study that compared transformational leadership to laissez-faire leadership among police officers found favorable outcomes for transformational leadership. So we know it's better than what they were using, but unfortunately, it wasn't implemented. So what do we make of all this information in the end? Well, the Rampart scandal is an example of what can happen when police leaders are not keeping each other and others accountable. There's many different types of leadership styles out there that can prevent corruption, and we need to understand what works best and with what type of workers and in what situations. In most situations, it's best to have workers who have high amounts of power and are going unsupervised to keep them in order and keep them checked. What are their ethics? What are their characters? And to look at them and make sure that they're not acting in manners that violate ethical principles, and make sure that they're treating people right and enforcing the rule of law properly. Corruption is impossible to prevent as well. So there's some individuals out there that are going to do things wrong no matter what type of leaders they have, and no matter what kind of security and other things are enacted to prevent their corruption. However, there are effective methods for detecting this and reducing their corruption and the risk of it sooner rather than later. So in the end, this may have not costed $1 billion, it could have costed a few $1,000,000 instead. And lastly, professional standards should not just be self-monitored, but it should also be supervised by other parts of the organization. So we check ourselves for corruption if you're acting in an ethical manner, and then you have your group making sure each person in that team is doing well. But then outside of our teams, we need to have independent standards also look at our work. It's a more independent view and it's less biased in the end, so a better service for feedback. Thank you for listening to our presentation on Rampart and corruption and leadership.